What you know, Alibis? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. It's Wednesday, July 23rd. Hope you guys have had a good day so far. Sentencing for Bryan Kohberger wrapped up a couple of hours ago. I encourage you to go watch it if you didn't. The victim impact statements were powerful and devastating. And I have to say, Kaylee's sister Olivia lit that courtroom up. She spoke directly to Bryan and, in fact, I believe used questions that came from a Reddit post he made asking questions to other people as part of his university work. She did not hold back. Before we jump into the press conference, just summarizing what was said, the Moscow Police Department will be releasing their investigative files today at some point. So when those drop, I'm going to dive right in. We may have another episode later today. Definitely will have several episodes breaking those down page by page. So keep an eye out for that. If you didn't watch sentencing, to me, Bryan was very indifferent, did not seem very fazed by the victim impact statements. Although I think when Olivia was giving her victim impact statement directly to him, that might have been the most uncomfortable I saw him, but still not on a big scale. So what happened at the press conference? We did learn some new things, so let's jump in. Prosecutor Bill Thompson, he said, we've reached the conclusion of the judicial process. Bryan straight up pleaded guilty and admitted under oath that the allegations are true. He has received a life and a death sentence. He will remain in the Department of Corrections until the day he dies. We are safe from him. He gets emotional, thanking people for their assistance in the investigation, and says he doesn't know if they would have reached the conclusion they did without everybody's dedication that was working on this case. He said, we understand not everyone agrees with the decision we made for a plea deal, but it's not a popularity contest. They made the most appropriate decision under the law and the facts to give this case closure in a sense that never would have been realized otherwise. The judge said today that the fallacy of expecting that Bryan would miraculously come clean, prosecutor said he does not have the power to compel that, meaning the judge and the prosecution team doesn't either. And it wouldn't be helpful. It would give Bryan a forum to share whatever he thought to control the dialogue, and that's not going to happen to our victims. They were asked about the reason the house was chosen. Is still speculation, but it was a very busy area and you could blend in there as kind of a hiding in plain sight sort of case. They don't know why the murders happened, and they were never able to determine who in that house was the target. As far as the Papa Roger account that has been the source of so much talk since this started, there was no connection. It was not Bryan Kohberger. As far as a second weapon being used, they said that all the evidence showed he used the K-bar knife and nothing else. There was a photo of a black heart by Bryan today during the proceedings. They did not see that during sentencing. But if you go back and watch, and I'll put it up here on YouTube, you could see a photo of what looks to be a drawn black heart. The prosecutor did say they could have asked Bryan to tell why, to move forward as part of the plea deal, but they didn't think there's anything he would say that would be true. They felt like it would be self-serving, and the prosecutor thought Bryan could use that to further victimize the families. When asked about where the weapon and the clothes were hidden, they said there was no evidence that led them even to a general location. The FBI were doing some kind of soil testing to see if potentially a shovel had been used in certain areas, but they never found anything. As far as the weapon, they did look everywhere that his phone records showed him as being, but again, nothing. A reporter mentions that there were reports Kaylee was stabbed over 30 times, and how is there no blood found with anything linked to Bryan? They've asked world experts on this very issue, but a person can wear the right type of clothing and not get blood all over them. Bryan was psychologically tested, and the results don't rise to a defense of his conduct under Idaho law. Now, obviously, all of that is sealed, so they can't speak to specifics, but any condition he may have did not play a role in their decision to accept the plea deal. His placement in prison will depend on the Idaho Department of Corrections, and none of us will know until after that happens. As far as Bryan's communications, they were monitored, but there was nothing insightful into why he committed the murders. He said they have hundreds, maybe thousands of hours, but nothing of evidentiary value in there. The conversations will not be released. The prosecution thinks it's not their policy to release that. And I can say personally, with covering the Lori and Chad Daybell cases over the years, it was the same. They do not release inmate conversations to the public. There was no evidence to show that Bryan was following any of the social media accounts of the victims. There was not one link they found. He said they wanted that link and they had every resource possible looking into that, but they have never found a single connection between Bryan, the victims, or the surviving roommates, and they still do not know a motive. Most of the sealed documents were sealed to prevent tainting a jury pool. Now, the prosecutor thinks most of these will be unsealed, such as requests for discovery and things like that, but some contain personal and private information about victims and the families, and those probably would not be unsealed under Idaho law of protection of unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. He acknowledges it's frustrating for people who want to look into this, but they also have to balance protecting the victims and their families. The prosecution was asked if they prepped a motive for trial since juries want a motive. The investigator said they often don't get to know that. The reality is that they don't have to have it, and oftentimes they're only known to the killer, and that's what we have here. The prosecutor says a lack of a clear motive is something they consider when preparing for trial because you have a jury who wants to figure it out. However, juries do tend to follow the law, and there's no element of motive in Idaho law for murder, so they just set it aside and knew it wasn't something that they could give that jury without speculating. He does say the evidence against Bryan was compelling, and it showed his guilt without having to worry about motive. When Bryan was arrested in Pennsylvania, he was brought to a facility and he was interviewed. The men that interviewed him used a lot of guidance from the FBI and their behavior analysis unit, and they helped in framing their interview strategy. Initially, the interview was very surface level just to keep him talking, but when they tried to get into the purpose of why they were there with him, Bryan ended the interview. During the interview, he was calm and relaxed, much like you've seen him in court. They got no tips or items of evidentiary value from Bryan's family, and the prosecution doesn't know what made Bryan take that plea deal. They move on to the roommate thinking she saw something in his hand, and to this day, they do not know what it was. They move on to computers, and they had an expert who was going to testify about using software to clean things off his work computer. They're asked, was there evidence he tried to use software to wipe things off his phone? And yes, there was evidence he used software to wipe many of his devices, and it was relatively effective. There was not much evidence obtained after that. They only found one active cell phone for him, but he did regularly use software to wipe things. He also used a VPN as well, which masks your IP address. When they were notified that they had found single-source touch DNA from the knife sheath, they knew they could take that further. That sample was flown to Othram, and that was the beginning of the investigative genetic genealogy process. They met with the FBI, and the FBI had further resources, so they shifted that to the FBI and let them take it from there. The prosecution did not have legal concerns about how the FBI conducted the investigative genetic genealogy investigation. He said it's no different than sending someone undercover to gather information, and also the judge made the right determination that Bryan's rights were not violated. They're asked about the knife sheath and if he had not left it, would they have caught him? And they said yes, they would, and mainly by his car. They had people going through line by line over tens of thousands of Elantras. Could have taken a week or months, but eventually they feel they would have got him on the car alone. When asked why the plea deal happened so quickly, the prosecutor said things changed dramatically following the June 18th hearing, where the defense wanted a continuation and also an alternate perpetrator motion. The judge made clear the defense was not going to prevail on either of those motions, and the reality of the trial was there, and there was nothing else standing in the way of this trial beginning. The state was still preparing for trial and ready to go. They were approached by the defense, and the prosecutor asked if Bryan was prepared to plead guilty. That answer took some time, so they consulted with the families and considered that when making their decision. He spoke about the logistics of the trial, bringing in 10,000 potential jurors. You have court staff making arrangements to process that part of the trial, and that dictated if the case was going to resolve, it needed to resolve quickly. Madison's family said this was the best possible outcome, and the prosecutors agreed. Bryan was ready to plead guilty as charged. The court was notified the next morning after Bryan said yes. So the court moved very quickly to get a plea deal done on the record, and also so that they would not be interrupted during trial. In Bryan's background, they found his education led him down a path focused on forensics, crime scenes, and they did look into that. But the prosecutor says, just so there is no speculation, the documents under seal regarding Bryan's background may or may not be released, but there was no history of violence or any predisposition to the crimes he committed. There was no indication of any behavior that preceded what happened in Idaho. The prosecutor said that families who disagreed with the plea deal made it very clear to them. Everyone grieves differently and will look at the resolution in their own light. There were families and family members who were not okay with the deal, and that's just a fact of life. When asked about speculation that Maddie served Bryan at the Mad Greek restaurant, they say there was no connection to that they could find. Nothing digitally or financially. Of course, they can't say he was never there, but after interviewing people and going through all of Bryan's financials and digital footprints, there was nothing that pointed to him ever being there. They found nothing in his studies that contributed to the planning process for the murders. He did take that crime scene class, but they don't have anything to show that the planning of the murders was the reason he took that class. So that was pretty much it for the press conference. I wanted to get that out for those of you who were not able to watch. Again, if you go under live on my YouTube channel, the full hearing is there for you to watch. And as soon as these documents drop, I'm all over it. I have freed my night up. For the moment these drop, I will be all in. So I'll keep you posted. Until then, hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon and evening, and we will see you soon.